So, the title of this talk is God, Fatherland, Family, on the existence of civil religion in the Estado Novo. The basic idea of this presentation is that if we look at civil religion from an academic perspective, many issues and topics which are typically associated with the identification of instances of civil religion, such as nationalism, ethnicity, and particularly sacrality of state, these are actually quite modern concepts. However, and focusing particularly on sacrality of state, if we look at Portuguese history, we can find several instances, starting from the 14th century, where a certain form of sacrality of state can already be found. And with it came also ideas of statehood and ethnic identity. So basically, the idea is to start off by offering the notions of sacrality of state throughout Portuguese history, in the 14th and 16th century, and then, moving into the First Republic, how these change into ideas of civil religion as academically understood, and finally how this culminates in the Portuguese dictatorship of the Estado Novo. So, starting off with pre-modern Portuguese sacrality of state, this is usually associated with two concepts. The first, the narrative of the Miracle of Ourique, and the second, Sebastianism. Both of these can be treated separately, but I do believe that these are genealogically related, and I don't think you can actually have Sebastianism without the Miracle of Ourique. And starting off with this one, the Miracle of Ourique is a very simple type of narrative, in the style of Constantine's In This Sign You Will Conquer story, and it basically relates the apparition of Christ to the first Portuguese king before the Battle of Ourique, and it essentially transmits the Portuguese royal lineage as divinely anointed by God, being the Portuguese kings a series of important players in the divine plan. It equally transmitted the idea of Portugal as a second Israel and the Portuguese people as a new chosen people. This idea, while originating in the 14th century and related to events supposedly happening in the 12th, can be seen to intertwine itself ideally with the expansion of the Portuguese Empire and its propagation of the Christian faith, which seemed to confirm the narrative of Ourique and to confirm also Portugal as an ecumenical and apostolic nation and a possible candidate for the fifth empire of the Book of Daniel. However, this whole mentality reaches its climax with the disappearance of King Sebastian on the Battle of Alcácer-Quibir, and this is when we get Sebastianism. With the disappearance of King Sebastian in battle, the possibility of the Portuguese crown falling to the Castilian king becomes a likely reality, and according to the exegesis of Ourique, this would be a breach in the divine plan, and, logically, due to the constant reinforcement of the narrative of Ourique, it was impossible for Sebastian to have disappeared. And thus, he becomes an imminently returning king, a kind of messiah who will eventually reclaim the Portuguese crown. These are essentially the two basic concepts of sacrality of state in Portuguese history, from where most others will eventually emerge. When we now get to the First Republic, established in 1910, this was a republic heavily influenced by French ideas such as laicite and even Jacobianism, heavily aggressive toward Catholicism and the monarchy, and these two ideas of sacrality of state get pushed aside as being intrinsically linked to these two institutions. In this time period, civil religion begins by being theorized by Republicans very much inspired by positivism. One of them was called Teófilo Braga, one of the most committed positivists of Portuguese history. On the topic of civil religion, a quote demonstrating this can be found when, referring to the celebration of the 300 years of the death of Camões, he would claim that conferences and national celebrations should in fact be regarded as civil mass, to which every citizen should take his wife and children. And here he is being directly inspired by Auguste Comte. Although Braga never tries to construct from within the state an idea of civil religion, his ideas never actually manifest themselves. The nature of the First Republic was in fact extraordinarily chaotic, and no long-standing ideologies actually get built during this period. An also very relevant Republican is the philosopher Sampaio Bruno, who actively builds upon the ideas of Braga by saying, "The fatherland is a principle of collective solidarity. The fatherland is a religion." This was also very much inspired by humanist ideas, but he would take a step back into more traditional Sebastianism. This is made explicit in his book O Encoberto, meaning the hidden one, which is a kind of one of the mystical titles of King Sebastian. But Bruno, however, reconceptualizes Sebastianism in a humanistic way, such as expressed in this quote from his book. "Let the cloud that covers a hero dissipate. The hero is not a predestined prince, it is not even a people, it is man. So he basically denationalizes Sebastianism and makes it a religion of humanity, as its own messiah, a revelation of humanity to itself. Apart from these, any other relevant ideas you get towards civil religion in the First Republic manifest outside of the political sphere and in literary circles. Very relevant among these is the name of Teixeira de Pascoais, a philosopher and poet. He in fact constructs one of the most complete instances of what might be called civil religion. Although he did not envision this to be a religion for the masses but rather for the elites, it is a very mystical and ontological construction whose exercise would, in an almost miraculous way, usher in all the necessary social reforms needed for the rebirth of Portugal. To this he calls saudosismo, a theory which included elements of divinization of landscape, the uniqueness of national language, ethnic identity, and the clergy of poets. Although very influential in literary circuits, this idea never really expands itself beyond these, and it is never attempted on a national scale. Besides this, another very relevant poet which should be mentioned is of course Fernando Pessoa. This is a very relevant modernist poet who really goes into a re-evaluation of Sebastianism and, as a modernist, reconceptualizes it in the light of more occultist and esoteric ideas. However, it is extremely complicated to offer a complete explanation of what Fernando Pessoa understands as Sebastianism, since he wrote immensely and wrote about this topic from a variety of angles. But from his more politically applied ideas, one of his texts can be quoted as saying, "A religion is socially useful when it comes close to fulfill three conditions. 1. Being national. 2. Being popular. 3. Being as much as possible susceptible to adaptation." Is there in Portugal any religious phenomenon over which we can lay the foundations for a new life? All pretensions of a rebirth, and this is likely a direct reference to Teixeira de Pascoais' ideas of the Portuguese rebirth, all pretensions of a rebirth of national life, which is not built on the religious base, will fall by its base, which, unless it is so, will be none. First, there is Catholicism, but Catholicism begins by being foreign. For this reason, it falsely unites the people. It unites it to a temporal foreign power, unites it to other peoples, meaning denationalizes it. And the text here kind of breaks off, since it's a quite fragmented text, as is typical of Pessoa. But he finishes by proposing the following question: have we another religious phenomenon? And this text is titled Sebastianism. So, Pessoa was proposing Sebastianism as the only native spiritual phenomenon from which concrete state building could happen. But, like everything else in Pessoa, none of this ever goes anywhere. Going now into the Estado Novo. In 1910 there is the Republican Revolution, in 1926 there is a military coup which establishes a dictatorship, and in 1928 Salazar is invited to head the Ministry of Economy, and finally, in 1932 he becomes the head of state and creates a dictatorship which would last until 1974. So, before we try to find what might be interpreted as civil religion within the Estado Novo, we actually should look at Salazar himself. He was basically a seminary in the 1900s. In 1910 he goes into the University of Coimbra to take law and economics, and while at the university he becomes the very vocal leader of the Centro de Democracia Cristã, or Academic Center of Christian Democracy. Here, he becomes friends with the future Cardinal Patriarch of Lisbon, Cardinal Cerceira. It becomes obvious that, from an early age, Salazar is very much a Catholic. So, looking for civil religion in the regime that he constructs becomes complicated due to his own Catholicism, especially when you compare it with other European examples. Focusing on the Italian case, Salazar refers to it in the following quote: "The fascist dictatorship is leaning towards a pagan Caesarism, towards a new state which recognizes no limitations of legal and moral order." He would further go on to say, "Portugal was not made or unified in modern times, nor did it take its form with a pagan and anti-human ideal of deifying a race or an empire." So, he is basically saying that civil religion as was being constructed in Italy is a pagan and even heretical concept from his Catholic perspective. And instead of aiming towards this type of spirituality within the state, he rather refers to the apostolic and universal vocation of Catholicism which was in our blood. So, his idea of what spirituality might be inherent to Portugal or to the state comes from his personal reading of Portuguese history and the place of Catholicism within this. He basically considers Catholicism to be an integral part of Portuguese identity, and as such, the ultimate form of state religion. However, this takes a complicated turn as we continue to study his speeches. From 1937, he would eventually say, "Beyond the intrinsic value of religious truth, individually, socially, we have the necessity for the absolute, and we will not create by our hands, among contingent and ephemeral things, what exists outside and above us, nor divert to the state the function of decreeing religion and define the principles of morality. This attitude has led us to consider power to be morally limited, and has kept us from committing the error of deifying the state, strength, wealth, technique, beauty, or vice. Conscious of the value, of the necessity in life of a superior spirituality, without aggravation of personal convictions, of sincere indifference or unbelief, we have respected the conscience of the believers, and we have consolidated religious peace. We do not discuss God." So, what this means is that, for Salazar, there is a necessity for the divine within the state, but this divinity cannot be generated or emanate from the state itself. It needs to be brought in externally to it. However, by using religious concepts and words, and by not defining these from within the perspective of the state, Salazar is making his discourse implicitly Catholic, even though he never mentions Catholicism. Even analyzing his concrete political actions and idealism, this owes a great deal more to Catholic social theory, and particularly Thomas of Aquinas, than it does to any form of national syndicalism or socialism. Also, during his dictatorship, education is very rapidly made Catholic. As according to Salazar's reading of history, Catholicism is an integrating part of Portuguese identity. Thus, by making education Catholic, he is effectively nationalizing it, which would also prevent further fascization of the country. In essence, Salazar's regime was seated on a national front into which the Portuguese Catholics were fully integrated, and this meant that there was no tangible distinction between the church and the state. If you supported the state, you implicitly supported the church, and if you supported the church, or simply had a Catholic lifestyle, you were also supporting the state. From this, some conclusions can be taken. In the Estado Novo, Catholicism is the only element which could be interpreted as civil religion. Even if Catholicism is never put forward as a state-sponsored form of religiosity, the state, or just Salazar, simply provides a space for Catholicism to fill, so as this may provide a spiritual framework for the state. Also, this proximity between the state and the church, and Salazar's personal proximity with elements of the Catholic hierarchy, meant that, on certain occasions, church authorities would attempt to imbue upon him a certain priestly and even saintly authority. In these instances, it is interesting to note that Salazar immediately rejects this type of power. Although this might seem like a contradiction, what is likely happening is that, for Salazar, accepting any kind of priestly investment from the church would eventually mean that his authority or decision-making legitimacy would become somehow dependent on church authority, and part of his power would be owned by somebody else. A completely unacceptable perspective. So, what this whole construction of state and religion meant was that Catholicism was inserted within the nation and within the state, but he was the ruler of the state, almost as if existing outside of it, meaning that the influence of the church on the state can be seen to be clearly limited by carefully orchestrated political and propaganda mechanisms. And with this, thank you.